So we are still on qualitative studies, and last time we saw interviews as one of the strategies for data collection in qualitative studies. And today we pass to observation. So we will discuss this other technique that is often combined with interviews in those that are commonly called ethnographic studies. So studies in which you go to a company and you study the cultural aspect of the company, or you try to understand what is going on within the process. And in software engineering, they are normally this type of study associated to case studies, a topic that we will study in depth later on. This is all the basic information that you need to understand, since also the terminology sometimes can be quite confusing. But in any case, observation and interviews are data collection strategies mostly used in ethnography, and ethnography in software engineering often boils down in case studies. Case studies have some differences with respect to ethnographies in social sciences, but we will see these differences later on. So let's start with observation. As you see, I'm reporting the slide here that we had last time. Observational techniques are data collection techniques that aim at considering the data that come from people. Okay. So we have seen at the initial lecture some information already about observation. Here we will focus a little bit more on the different types of observations that exist. There is a first distinction between systematic and structured observation and unstructured observation. So structured and systematic observation are focused on observing participants according to some predefined rules that can be related to time or actions, so that different participants can be compared in terms of behaviors. For example, I want to see the differences in terms of behavior between developers and testers. For example, I may want to observe how many interactions the testers have with the rest of the subjects, of the actors of the company, with respect to developers. How much time the different subjects, the different roles spend in their actual task alone, and how much time do they spend working together with other or interacting with members of other groups. So this can be useful for understanding the work, the behavior of the people in a structured way, and comparing according to specific dimensions, so actions and time. Normally, in this observation, you use an observation schedule, which is similar basically to a questionnaire, in which you write down what you see according to some predefined scheme. You annotate the frequency and quality of the meetings, for example, if you are focusing on meetings, or if you want to understand how do they work, you just annotate the final task that they perform during each day. That can be, for example, uploading the code that they've developed, or stopping their testing activity when they have solved a certain amount of problems. So what is the trigger for considering a working day closed? You may look at this as management aspects. Actually, they are management aspects, but in the end, this type of thing have an impact also on the final software. So they are the behavior of the different roles that participate to the development of a product has an impact, and it needs to be considered and evaluated when you manage software engineering processes. The alternative is unstructured observation. So in this case, you don't have an observation schedule. You normally are there in the company, and you are also normally participating, but here we are just focusing on on the aspect of structured versus unstructured. We will discuss the participation just in the next slide. in this case, you just record as much detail as possible, so you don't have a predefined focus, but you want to observe what is relevant from that environment, what is emerging as more evident with respect to other details. And the goal is developing a narrative account of the behavior that you observe, so that you, later on, by reflecting on your notes and what you have observed, can some meaningful content can emerge. So in one case, you already have a focus and want to study something precise. In the other case, you are in a more you have a more vague goal and probably more time also, and you can spend time there and record the detail and understand the situation in depth. Another distinction is between participant observation and non-participant observation. With participant observation, the observer is joining the group. Basically, he spent a long time with a group, with an organization or community. In most of the cases, with developers or other roles that are working in a certain company, and the goal is to elicit the meaning that they attribute to their environment and behavior. So understand the culture of the place where you are. Also, this may seem something irrelevant to you, but between companies, in the end, there are different cultures. For example, if I am in a safety critical company that develop cars or develop railway systems, which have embedded software that needs to be safety critical, and so needs to be thoroughly tested at different levels, and you need to be sure that you don't cause accidents, basically. In this case, we normally speak about safety culture, focused on requirements, focused on testing, and slower, for example, than the culture you may have in agile teams that are less focused on documentation, more focused on delivering prototypes one after the other in an incremental way. So, and these are really cultures. These are distinction. Of course, I've made the strongest distinction between two different viewpoints of software development, but you may have a distinction also within the same company. For example, still considering a safety critical company, you normally have the development team and the testing team, and they must be separated, okay? So you may observe that there is actually a different culture in terms of how they approach the software. Of course, the developer is the one that constructs the software, and of course they take care that the software works well, but they are not as concerned as the testing team about all the things that are related, for example, to the documentation of the software, all the things that are related to the thorough testing of the software. Whenever the testing team find the bugs, of course, you may have some reaction from the development team. Whenever the testing team is asking for more documentation, more information, of course, the development team tend to have some reaction, and also the way they consider each other. For example, the developer team may consider the testing team composed of people who don't know how to program, okay, because they are not programming in the end. They are producing paper for them. And on the other hand, the testing team may perceive the culture of the development team as people that can just program and cannot think in a larger scope. Of course, there's no truth in any of this viewpoint, but it's the culture that creates the team, creates the group, and you can observe it throughout a participant observation. And in the end, it is quite surprising at the beginning when you enter the organization and you see this type of things, especially if you've never been in a company. But these are very common dynamics between teams in a company. And again, as the behavior of one single person can have an impact on the software, also the behavior of the different teams one towards each other can have an impact on the software. The participant in this case, they observe how much they observe, of course, different things that we already listed. But the issue here is that participant observation can have different degrees of participation. So you can be part of the team and actually do something for them. For example, you are in an internship as a researcher, so you have to develop something for the team, of course, that supports somehow, for example, the requirements review activity. You are part of the team and you are developing a tool that is actually helping them to accelerate the review of the requirements. And or you may participate once in a while in the review of the requirements. So you are not staying all the time observing and working, but you can participate with a certain frequency. For example, once per week you can be there, or you can contribute, or you can just observe and interview people. This is more so-called non-participant observation, when you observe, but you are not participating to what is going on in the social setting. But there are different shades, of course. It is in general, it is quite common that if you participate and so you perform a participant observation, you do also something more. So you do a contribution to a team. No participant observation, you may be there also for a long time, but you don't give so much contribution as except observing. Of course, you have advantages, disadvantages, because with a participant observation, you are there, you can contribute, you can understand better what's going on inside the team, but you are also part of the team. So after a certain while, you take positions. The culture is not something that you observe anymore, but you are part of a culture. So this becomes difficult. Non-participant becomes difficult from a researcher standpoint, because of course our goal is to be as more objective as possible. In this case, is not possible. With non-participant observation, on the other hand, without really participating, okay, you are judging, but you don't really know in depth how things are and how can be really perceived, experienced by a person who's there. Okay, so this to give you an idea of the two main categories. So, but imagine that between participant and non-participant, there are many shades, different degrees of participation, of course. And then finally, you have another distinction between simple observation and contrived observation. With simple observation, you have no influence on the situation. So it is it is closer and more common in non-participant observation, because you are observing. Of course, if you are part of the team and you contribute, you also have some influence. But in this case, in the case of contrived observation, is that you alter the situation to observe the effect of an intervention. This is more common, because it's more common if you are a software engineer to go to a company and develop actually a tool for them and see how things change, how these impact on what is the acceptance of the tool, how does this change the process. So the normal thing is that you have simple observation is often non-participant, and contrived observation, of course, is often participant. Of course, you can have situations that are in between. So you have developed a tool at the university, and you bring it at the company, and you gather interviews, you test with the developers, and you gather afterwards interviews in which you understand how did they experience the usage of the tool. So these are different ways to let you understand that, there is a large amount of possibilities for performing this observation, and there's no single way. But the idea is that there is a team, there is a community. You want to study social aspect or transform the process in some way. You have different degrees of participation that do not depend only on you, because may depend also on the needs of the company, of course, because if they contact the university because they want to improve a specific task. Of course, you have and you are a PhD student or a master student, and you have to go there for an internship. You don't have many choices whether to be non-participant, participant. You are there. You have to develop a tool, improve that task, and moreover, you have to understand how this modification, this alteration of the situation impact on the actual development. Okay. So again, participant observation, you can have different ways of participating, as I was describing before. In this case, we focus on how do they perceive you in the group. You can be a covert full member, so the others do not know that you are a researcher and you are hired by the company. This is very unlikely to happen. At least in my experience, it may happen, but it's not the most frequent thing for us. This is more for anthropologists that participate to a group to a specific social group, and they don't know the people belonging to the group. They don't know that you are a researcher, you are a covert. And otherwise, you can be overt full member. So the others know that you do research, but you are part of the company. So you are a PhD student, but also work for the company. This is more likely to happen. Or most likely you are a participating observer. So they know you do research and you cooperate, but not as full member. So you are a research assistant, and you are placed in the company for a certain amount of time, either for doing internship or for a collaboration in the framework of improving a certain task of the company. Partially participating, so you just partially participate to the activity, but observation is not the main source of data. You also use interviews and document analysis. So you are in this case more a researcher than a participant. Okay. And finally, non-participating, so with some interaction but minimal observation, contact through interviews and document analysis. This is similar to it is some case an extreme, let's say, of participant observation, because you are not actually in practice joining the team. This is okay. So I spoke about participant observation and the two cases that are most common. So participating observer and partially participating. These are the most common in software engineering. What do you do when you do this observation? Besides doing possible interviews, because these are also common way to complement observation, you take notes. This is nothing, and not saying nothing surprising. Basically, you can have you take field notes. They can have different forms. You can take just mental notes, just memorize what you see, and this can be done in those relaxed environments in which you don't want the people see you taking notes, of course. scratch notes when you can write unseen but do not have much time. So when you do ethnography, always use a paper notebook or the mobile, so that also if they see you, you can be just text messaging, okay? Audio notes, this depends really on how you are. You can record what you see either in the breaks or in certain moments. It is quite important to also consider to have someone who receives these audio notes, so that you have another individual that can be the recipient of this information, and you can send WhatsApp voice messages, for example. Why? Because you will discover that by thinking out loud and repeating what you've seen, and thinking that there is another person that can hear you, can allow you to express yourself better and to better analyze. So this seems again some things that are not they are not so difficult to imagine, but it is crucial that you consider, because just observing and thinking that you have understood something it doesn't work, and you tend to forget. It's very easy to forget. Mental notes, very often you may forget, so you may also you want to associate them to something that you see in the specific space, and that afterwards can trigger you the mental notes that you took. For example, you see that there is a certain position of an object in the space, and you try to associate that object in that space to the thing that you were reflecting about during the, for example, the coffee break, or in any relaxed environment in which you cannot take note. Or fulfilled notes. Basically, these will be your main data sources. At the end of every day, or whenever it's possible, you should write a diary with the reflection of what you've seen. What should they contain? Any impression or fact? They should be like diaries, really. And again, combine this the WhatsApp voice messages and the voice notes can be useful also to write down these field notes afterwards. Again, you will see that after reading them, after spending even just a month and reading back to the notes that you took at the beginning, you will see that you didn't remember many things. So these are really important for building theories later on. There are 5 main dimensions of observational studies. So there is a goal of the researcher, the focus, the space and location, duration of the study, and degree of participation that we've discussed thoroughly before. The goal of the researcher in general is either to understand, in which case you are there, you are often not participating, and you want to understand what's going on, and or improve. So you are actually going there, observing, but actually helping the company to change their process for doing some activity. Or solve. So you know that there is an actual problem, and you participate to solve it. For example, a relational problem between the teams. Focus can be people, relationship, activities, artifacts, or information in general. So normally, quite often you focus on improve activities or understand activities and understand relationship. These are the most common way you approach these studies. Space and location, you can consider local software engineering or distributed software engineering. This means that you may focus, because I'm speaking about you go to a certain company, but you could go also to a company that is distributed. So you can analyze the behavior and the interaction of people in the company, in the way they communicate with each other, for example, through emails. Okay, when you have a company that has a division in India and one in Italy, for example, or in another location. Normally, these studies are more focused on the concept of distributed software engineering and global software engineering. This is the theme. because of course it's way different. It has peculiarities related to the distribution of the work that that make it particularly suitable for studying communication. What are the positive and negative aspects of far away software development, and this type of thing. So this space and location, of course, determine the way you do your observation. It is of course obvious, because with local software engineering, when you consider local software engineering, you are there, you are in the company, so you are experiencing actually the atmosphere. In the other case, unless you go to the different companies, but it is quite uncommon, you don't have the actual direct experience. Duration of the study and frequency of presence. So duration of the study is normally, for observational study, in average in software engineering, you stay there about 8 months. And frequency of presence, of course, depends on the type of observer that you are, but either you are 4 days in the company and 1 day at the university, or vice versa, let's say. So if you seldom go there just for a specific meeting to observe, but if you are actually contributing in some way, in some ways, you stay there at least 4 days, 4 days per week. Degree of participation, we've seen already. There is different shades. So, but main categories are participant versus non-participant. Observation process. Observation process is very similar to the other processes that we saw. You start from research questions. You identify the research questions that give you the scope. You then identify the company or companies that need to be involved. You define the role of observer, so what you're going to do. You define the timeline. This is fundamental. So how long will you stay there, and how frequently will you stay there? And your main focus. Your main focus, as we said, the focus can be actors, can be activities, etc. So after defining these main points, which in the end are the 5 points that I listed before, you have to solve bureaucratic issues. I marked this in red because in companies you may find out that you will find out, if you are doing any type of study with company, that you cannot publish everything. So it needs to be very clear. It needs to be very clear since the beginning what the company will allow you to publish, and this should be made clear as early as possible. Because in some cases, if you are really developing a tool that is improving the activity of the company, and in the end, it actually solves the problems of the company, you have to understand to which extent this can be published. And this can be made public, because the company may not want to appear, because they have competitors that they may copy their approach. But on the other hand, since you are a researcher and giving a contribution without publishing, unless you are oriented to be hired by the company, you don't earn anything. So it is important that this is made clear since the beginning. Of course, not every corner can be made clear, but it is important that this is discussed before any study begins. Then you have the execution, and in the execution, of course, you do the observation, you participate, you take notes. Always analyze and rework notes. Even if you wrote them, you will not remember what was in your mind when you wrote the notes. So look at them frequently, and this will help you build also your theory around what you observe. And in this case, you have produced your observational data that is a large amount of data, and all frequently will need to be combined with interviews and other viewpoints. Checklist for observational study. This is valid. As I said, observational study are data collection activities that are common in any ethnographic studies. And this checklist is valid for any ethnographic studies that combine both observation and interviews, and also archival data collection, any activity that you perform in a well-defined community. So in the design phase, the checklist, so the set of questions that you should ask yourself are: what organization or themes will you study? What environment do they have? Why do you study them? This is describing basically the object of your research, and also allows you to better understand what is the cultural focus that you have. Because I said, ethnographic studies and observational studies focus on cultural aspect, okay, and try to understand which are the projects going on in the organization, who is involved, and what are the type of links with other organizations, for example, other company that may be suppliers for them, etc. What things and who will you focus during your study? So important to select the focus, the key roles, so the project leaders, consultant, or developers. So understand who are the key roles, and how much do you know about the organization before you start the study. This is really important, because if you enter the organization without knowing anything, you have to allow yourself a certain amount of time that can vary a lot, and can be quite long, because some organization, especially if the organization is a large multinational company, because it is difficult to understand which are the roles, the different roles in the organization, different roles of the team, and you have to evaluate how much effort it will take to spend learning how the organization works. So state the way already at the beginning in which you plan to get some knowledge about the organization. It is good to interview actually the people that you have contact with before going to the organization, also to get an understanding of how things will be there, so that when you are there, you don't find yourself in a position in which you don't understand what's going on in certain situations. Finally, how long will your study last? As I said, 8 months is normally average duration for understanding something and contributing in some meaningful way, actually. If your duration is less, study more examples. So, for example, you can study multiple projects, and the different project belonging to the same team, or you can study the same type of team in different companies. But try to get an understanding that is culturally relevant, an understanding of the culture, actually, that should be your main focus in this case. Is 8 months is the time that you should normally spend, at least. This was for design phase. For the execution phase, so the part in which you actually carry out, you have to understand, first of all, how will you enter in the organization. So normally this how is already given to you, because you have a contact probably in the organization, or your professor, your tutor has a contact, or you enter there through some form of internship. And you have to understand to which extent may you disturb normal work, and how much can you contribute to the project. Because if you are modifying the way of work, of course, what you are observing is not the actual reality of the organization, but it's the reality with you in it. So you are modifying the environment somehow. So this needs to be considered and acknowledged. Who will collect and analyze the data? So one researcher or more. Normally it's one researcher, but it is really, really important that you consider also the possibility that there may be some relevant benefit in having more subjects, comparing their viewpoint on the organization. So of course it is difficult to coordinate, but at the same time, it gives you a more complete view of the thing, and during the data collection activity. It is, of course, also more difficult to report because you have different viewpoints, but the understanding will be better. For example, I give you because the viewpoint can be radically different. I participated to this observation in which there was these people that were interviewing a customer. It was a simulation. It was a fictional customer and fictional interviewee, fictional requirements analyst, fictional interviewers, so fictional requirements analyst. And I was there observing the interaction. There was this guy that was, to me, was particularly good in performing the interview. And so I annotated his style, the way that he was asking questions, etc. On the other hand, afterwards, in these interviews, at the end of the interview, I asked the customer her viewpoint on the actual interview and on the interviewer, and she said, "No, this was terrible. He was so self-confident, so annoying." So what the person that I found the best one among the different cases that we observed was, for her, for the person that was interviewed, the customer, the worst one. So you understand that depending on the position that you may have radically different viewpoints. This was quite surprising for me, and but these type of things are quite common. So adding just one person means adding possibly a completely opposite viewpoint. So it may be important to have one researcher or more. It may enrich a lot your work. What data will be collected? Recording of interviews, application log, daily documents, videos of meetings. So you can collect more than just observation. And in this case, you need to detail what are the sources of your data. How many aspects can your data show? So again, this is related to what I was saying before. In this case, instead of considering just triangulation as a means, as an approach in which you have different viewpoints from two different researchers, you have to consider triangulations in the sense that different aspects of the organization itself can emerge from your data. Different aspects, I mean, the viewpoint, for example, of testers and the viewpoint of designers. So to have a more complete view of the organization itself and the possible internal viewpoints, not just the external one, okay, that can come from a researcher. Then will you put your experience into the analysis? So analyze in which way you can impact on the actual study. This is just a checklist that somehow structure what we already listed in the previous slides. Main issues. Observational studies take a lot of time. As I said, 8 months is a lot of time. Most of the time, you have to do the work for the company. Either you are hired or not, or you contribute with the tool, but you have to work for them in the end, especially if you stay 4 days out of 5 days, you become part of the company and report about your experience. So you have 2 jobs. So you are a researcher, and at the same time you work for the company. So it may be heavy, but it's also rewarding because you get real reflection and understanding of the world that surrounds you. Of course, everything is biased and subjective. If you are there will be people that you like and people you don't like, things that you like to do and things you don't like to do. And this has an impact on the way that you report your experience. So this is unavoidable with observation. But it is important that you clearly state and clearly describe the context and your viewpoint. The context means the characteristics of the company and the viewpoint that can bias your observation. Another issue is that you produce a lot of data, a lot of written data. a lot of written data are coming from your notes. This is also hard in the end to report in a paper. I will give you suggestion on how to report this type of things, but there's no general guidelines for software engineering for this specific type of studies and how to report them, or at least not a widely adopted standard. And they are more suitable for books. Actually, in ethnography, you see books about ethnography, about people that have spent 1 year in a certain community and are reporting their experience in that community. For example, a friend of mine was working as an anthropologist in Tibet, and she was spending 1 year there together with the people there and doing their work with the goats and with they were nomads, these people. And afterwards, of course, what you produce is a sort of is almost a novel, of course, based on the reality that you see. And she was taking, of course, notes, field notes throughout the whole day. Of course, these are cases that rarely happen in software engineering, and so it is very unlikely that you publish an ethnographic study in software engineering in a book. Okay, so you need to find ways to do this observation and at the same time make them suitable for something that can be published in a 10 pages paper and that can give some new information. Okay, as I said, there's no accepted standard for reporting these studies, and many things may be confidential, you may not publish them. So the message here is that observations are important. Observations are the way for understanding things in a deep way, but also for the reason of reporting and the reason that in the community, pure observation is not so common in the software engineering community. Always combine the observation with interviews, because interviews are easier to report, and there is more evidence that can be published in a shorter way, and possibly include also the analysis of archival data if they allow you the access, because of course you may want to combine this observation with the analysis, for example, of the code, but in some cases you may not be allowed to access the source code. So here we are still speaking about the data collection. Okay, we will see data analysis later on. Now let's briefly see another type of data, another type of source of data, which is archival data, and the way we can do collection of archival data. Archival data, we will just briefly touch this topic. Archival data came from documents or from systems, and can be, for example, coming from the logs, from software documentation and emails. Here, we are generally speaking still about natural language data, so qualitative data, okay? Because we are speaking about qualitative data analysis. Of course, the closer we go to a system, the larger the amount of data and the more quantitative they are. So you understand that these techniques for data collection, I've listed them in an order of relevance also for software engineering. So most of the things that you have to remember and you may encounter in practice are related to interviews, but observational techniques are relevant. Archival data collection in terms of natural language documents are relevant, but they are more relevant, much more relevant for quantitative studies and what is related to the large topic of mining software repositories that we mentioned. So as said, archival data can be qualitative or quantitative. For example, for quantitative, you have number of commits in a repository, time spent in a task, and qualitative, you have documentation, core comments, social media information, app reviews. I'm giving this very different example because you have to consider that we are addressing the whole software engineering process. So it has documentation, it has comments in natural language. Also, after deployment, you may have some feedback coming from social media, for example, from Twitter, that may be relevant to you to improve your application, to improve your software. Similarly for app reviews, this is another input for the requirements, because in the app they may tell you, hey, I need this type of feature, or I may discover that I have some bug that I need to solve directly from the users. Of course, in archival data, especially if they are related to documentation, they also include the models and diagrams. So something that is not just words. Normally, in most of the studies, we deal mostly with words, also for a problem of reporting. Actually, these studies. Archival data types. Here we have three main groups. You can have three main categories. Of course, these categories are not so strict, but it's to give you some example. You can have official documents that are produced throughout the software engineering process. That can be business requirement specification, that are the requirements, the user requirements, so-called requirements from the viewpoint of the customer. System requirement specification, that is more oriented to the developer. System design, that is made of diagrams, descriptions of diagrams, user manuals, test reports, requirements review, everything, all the documentation that is produced throughout the software process. Of course, there are some processes that are more document intensive and they produce a lot of these documents. Some processes that are very lightweight and do not have all these, do not produce all these documents. You can have also, these are the official documents, let's say. But then you might have the internal data that support the software process, that are, for example, that are not, of course, official, and they are issues and bug reports, emails, code comments. You already understand that the amount of these documents and the issues of these internal data, although they are also in natural language, are completely different from the ones that you have in official documents. And finally, you may have also data related to the software process itself, but not part of the internal data produced by the company or by the subjects in the companies. And these are app reviews, tweets, information in Stack Overflow, so information that is used as input for developing software, for example, and tutorials, everything that surrounds the development of software, and maybe an input for the actual process. Normally, qualitative analysis is performed in depth only on the official documents that are produced, because they are more dense, they are more rich. For the other documents, you normally use simple classification. So the qualitative analysis boils down in distinguishing, for example, if an app review is reporting a bug, or is reporting a requirement, or is simply praising the app, or it's just an angry comment. Okay, so classifying the reviews. Why? Because this type of information is more limited. Each single item is very short, and the main goal is understanding what is relevant and what is not in this large amount of information. So you understand what may be the differences in terms of qualitative data analysis, and you also understand that in general this classification is mostly useful not purely for the qualitative research, but also for developing software that supports the automatic classification, for example, of app reviews or relevant tweets for my company. These are examples to make it clearer that even within the same type of archival datum, you may have wide differences, okay, between the different type of format. For example, these are all requirements that you may find in different companies, or even in the same company. For example, you may find in a company that is using agile development, you may find requirements that are expressed in the form of user story. So as a user, I want to share pictures so that my friend will see them. In a company that is developing railway systems, you may find these requirements that if you are not familiar with railway system, you surely don't understand, because it is, and this is a high-level requirement that says if track data, at least to the location where the relevant MA ends, are not available on board, the MA should be rejected. This is a real requirement, okay? So you understand that. First of all, is way different from the user story that is described before, because that is clearly understandable. On the other hand, everything here, not just the single, you may understand all the single word, but you're not able to associate these words to something concrete. So you understand that the background that is needed to analyze this data is very large. So before starting an analysis of this type of documents, of course, you need to be in the company for quite a long time and have understood how the system works and how the whole process works. And the corresponding one sentence requirements that more low level, so closer to the actual software, is closer to code almost, and is still a requirement. Then you can have completely unstructured requirements or structured use cases. So these are also requirements that that can be found. Other cases of different type of information, but also is somewhat associated again to requirements, is users' feedback and bug to the requirements activity, but coming from external subjects. Possibly are users' feedback. Users' feedback are, it would be nice to have a way to search my previous messages by keyword. This is understandable, is a requirement, is coming from a person that is suggesting to improve a certain app with a new feature. Or a bug report that can list some defects that have been found. These are all natural language, these all qualitative data that can be used for qualitative analysis, mostly for requirements, for the cases that I listed before. They may be used for qualitative analysis in an in-depth way. In this case, the orientation is mostly classification. Of course, also in the cases of requirements, you may have the need to just classify them. For example, if you want to understand which are defective and which are not defective. But this is another stream, let's say, of research that is not mainly concerned with qualitative data analysis, because qualitative data is much more than simple classification. Of course, again, here I repeat a concept, but it's important. The type of archival data to consider depend on the context. So depend on the process of the company, the domain of the company, the task, the company size, etc. I think that with these different examples that I gave you, they show you the variety of possibility that you may encounter, and the knowledge that is needed for each single case to understand it and to make sense of it in the context. Because also, if you look at this bug report, you do not get any relevant information without knowing actually the context where it comes from. This is a process for archival data collection, and simplified, of course, they are put always in a context of a larger study, a case study quite often, or a study in which you have performed also interviews, for example. But in general, you write down the research question, you select companies or tools if you are resorting, for example, to archival data that are coming from open source repositories, or like from public sources of data. definition of data types, so the data types in which you want to focus, and so again, solve bureaucratic issues. If you are dealing with open source data, in general, the bureaucratic issues are more limited. But if you are dealing with a company and you want to publish the data, you may need afterwards, if you want to publish, to anonymize them. And you need to make sure, again, as even more than for observational studies, you have to make sure that you can publish, for example, examples, excerpts, fragments of the documents in your actual study. So this is quite key also at this stage to solve all the bureaucratic issues. Execution, you do a preliminary analysis for the selection. This preliminary analysis for documents in a company is performed on the documents that you have, of course, that they can grant you access to. And for public data, you select what is more representative. We will see this a little better when we study mining software repositories. And then you select a representative sample and you select this data. It is important that is written in green, if possible, if they allow you. Do not just share a portion of the data in your paper, but share them with some repository so that everyone can use your data later on. Repositories can be GitHub or Zenodo, which is a typical repository for shared data, but always remember to anonymize them. This anonymizing, there are techniques for anonymization also of anonymization of data in general, and these have been applied by this paper in software engineering. So if you are interested, please check this reference here. So concepts are consider for archival data. Main concepts are: you can have official documents that of course are longer, and you want to inspect them to understand something more about the company, or you may have other external related documents or internal documents that are like emails or bug reports or this type of things that are shorter, more noisy, and that normally are used for simple classification. The qualitative data analysis is simple classification. But always remember, and the other two dimensions is whether they are public or they belong to a certain company. If they are public, you need to do some form of anonymization anyway, because if they are public, for example, on GitHub, there may be names of developers associated to them. You need to delete those names. So it is important that you anonymize even public data. If they are confidential, belonging to the company, it's very difficult that they allow you to share the data, unless they are very old historical data. But if they allow you, it is important that you share, and but it is even more important that you anonymize them. Of course, archival data are often connected with other data, like observation are connected with interviews. Also, in this case, archival data, if in an actual qualitative ethnographic study, are also connected with observation and interviews. If your study is just based on classification of requirements defect or classification of app reviews, of course, you don't relate it relate also on observation and interviews, because your focus will be, in most of the cases, classifying this data and afterward building a machine learning system that is doing the classification in the same way as the human is doing. But again, I remark that this is separated from the qualitative data analysis, but since you are speaking about archival data, mentioning this type of things is important to let you understand that there is a continuum, let's say, between the different techniques that are used, and each group of technique is more appropriate for also for certain type of data and certain type of goals. So the classification that we make is basically is useful, but in the end is artificial, because there is always some case that is in between. Okay. Issues with archival data. There are several issues. Documentation and internal data may not be updated with the software. So very often comments are not updated, test cases are not updated. So you have a software, you may read the documentation and the requirements, but these are updated later on. Okay, this is very important to consider. It may be not understandable. An example was given before. You may need additional documents. And in some cases, documentation may not exist, and you have to elicit information from the code itself or from the system itself by trying it out. So you take the system and you try and you test it and you do some scenario, or with the help of someone, and you try to understand how it works. So in some cases, documentation is not accessible or doesn't even exist. In projects that are paper rich, so in processes such as the safety critical ones, it may be hard to make sense of how certain documents are used and which is their role in the process. Consider that if you compare different documents from different nations, for example, if you are doing research on global software engineering, you might find that they're using different languages. For example, even if the company is a multinational American company, you may find that some documents may be in Italian if you are studying the company in the Italian divisions, or the ones in China may be in Chinese. So there may be quite large problems that may emerge in this and quite unexpected. For the data that are related to the software process, so for example, the app reviews, there is a lot of data and potentially noisy data. So there may be typos, slang, errors, all these type of problems. The relevant data may be limited. So, for example, most of the app reviews are not informative. And again, as I've said several times, they are normally just classified, not studied in depth, and are used to train machine learning algorithm to do the classification. So they are not subject with the type of data analysis that we will study after the break. That is grounded theory, thematic analysis, and coding.